Tsuruko Haraguchi's work got a lot of backlash. Most of this was due to the fact that she was the first female Japanese psychologist. A lot of the backlash during this time came from male Japanese psychologists. And all of the backlash was strictly about her gender, with no proof whatsoever whether her research was actually wrong. In modern times, a lot of schools have tried to replicate her studies, but they haven't proven or disproven it yet because their experiments were so wildly different from her actual experiment that it didn't actually prove or disprove anything. So what I decided to do is create my own study similar to hers, but with my own modern twist, and my experiment itself would be close enough to her actual experiment to prove or disprove what she was trying to put into her thesis. And finally, we'll actually get the answer of whether or not she was right. We will finally find out if the unconscious bias was actually a bias or if it was truth. As I was trying to prove her theory, I took some of her own hypotheses in her thesis and used them as my own. Some of which are as follows. Prolonged cognitive activity sends one's brain into overdrive, leaving an individual in an exhausted state and hindering productivity and cognitive function. Decrease in efficiency of memory and lower pulse rates is a result of exhaustion and slowed productivity. Feeling of fatigue is correlated with the state of mental inefficiency. Efficiency increases during continuous work, but affects one's work when multiple tasks are carried out one after another. Difficult and disagreeable work that is continued for long periods of time brings about a decrease in efficiency. Continuous cognitive activity has an unfavorable influence on other functions, such as memorization, association, etc. The more knowledgeable a person is on a subject, the less affected they are by fatigue. There are physical effects caused by mental cognition such as headaches, tremors, eye pain, cramps, etc. Haraguchi's setup was as follows. She recorded pulse and body temperatures to see the effect on physiological processes to find out direction and amount of change in pulse rate during continuous mental work. For experiment 1, the function tested for continuous work was the exercise in multiplying mentally a two-place number by a two-place number. For example, 61 times 28. For this experiment, with the signal go, subjects looked at the first example and memorized the two-place numbers. With their eyes closed, he or she multiplied them mentally, and as soon as the answer was obtained, it was written down, and they would immediately move on to the next example. The experimenter recorded the time they finished writing each answer. The reason that they memorized it and didn't do it on the paper was because it would eliminate the chance of sensory fatigue, which is what occurs when you look at a sensory object for too long. For example, looking at a test for more than 2 hours. If the subject forgot the numbers, they could look at them again, but time was added to how long it took them to complete the task. Haraguchi started this multiplication experiment with 4-place numbers, but it took too long and was too difficult. And she used herself as a part of the experiment to test if this would be a reliable experiment. However, this was not reliable. So she moved on to 2-place numbers because it would be easier but still difficult enough, and it would take long enough for the subjects to possibly get the feelings of fatigue. The placement of the numbers were random, and the distribution of easy and difficult questions were by chance. She used an ordinary watch. The experimenter recorded the time they finished writing each answer. After this part of the experiment, Haraguchi had a test for transferred fatigue mental functions that was tested by memorizing nonsense syllables, and the ability to add columns of 10 numbers. This was given by the same method of the multiplication test. She used 24 examples for this part of the experiment. Following this, the relation of work done by length of rest period was given. There were 3 different breaks that she had organized for her subjects: 10 minutes, 60 minutes, and 180 minutes. It is important to note that all of her subjects were above the age of 20. And of her subjects, all but 7 were professors or graduate students of psychology. Following this part of the experiment, time was taken figuring out the English translations of German words. There were 2 lists of 10 provided, and the subjects had to translate them from German to English. The second list of words was just the first list, but jumbled up. The pulse rate and temperature was measured before and after mental work was complete, so at the start of the experiments and at the end of them. Thorndike, unlike Haraguchi, had 16 subjects, and sex was not stated for Thorndike or Haraguchi's experiments. For Haraguchi, not even names were stated. She used the first and last initial of all of her subjects. Thorndike, unlike Haraguchi, had subjects measure their own times. So for my experiment, I wanted to do something similar to both Thorndike and Haraguchi and make it so it is adaptable for high school students, the ages of 13 through 18 years old. What I did was I had 3 experiments. My first experiment was a mental multiplication much like Haraguchi's. I had a 2-place number times a 2-place number, and I had a sheet of 21 questions of this kind. The way I came up with the numbers for the questions was I rolled 4 dice and I came up with the numbers that way. For this experiment, I planned to time my subjects, how long it took them to complete the entire thing start to finish, and for how long it took them to complete each particular question. After this, there was the nonsense syllable experiment. For this part of the experiment, I came up with a list of 10 nonsense syllables that were computed randomly, so there would be no bias. I allowed my subjects 15 minutes in total to memorize all 10 of them in order. They did not have to take the complete 15 minutes, but they were told that they were allowed to. For this part of the test, I timed how long it took them and if they took the full 15 minutes. Then, I recorded them to see how many they got right. Unlike this part of the experiment, I did not combine my nonsense syllables with an addition test, with the 10 numbers in a column. I felt that the addition was just too easy and would take away from the mental fatigue. Finally, for my final test, I did an Italian translation instead of the German one that Haraguchi did. The reason I decided this is because most students in high schools in Pennsylvania and around the world take languages now. Usually these languages include Spanish and German. Knowing that, I decided that German words would be too easy to translate, so I went with Italian. For this part of the experiment, I had 20 words that people would have to translate from Italian to English. I would time how long it would take them overall to complete this task. Overall, I would take their pulse before the experiments started and after the experiment started, to find out if there was a decrease like Haraguchi and Thorndike both found. The reason I decided to not take temperature during my experiment was because temperature would be too difficult to calculate and I already had many variables to work with thus far. Overall, I had 12 people that were my subjects, and sex was in fact distributed evenly. Although I planned on not revealing gender or names like Haraguchi, because I knew that some subjects would not want to have their gender or their names revealed. As shown here, my groups were broken up much differently from Haraguchi's. This was because there was a lot of time between her breaks. So she had 30, 60, and 180. That is very wildly different from one another. But because Haraguchi was testing people that were all over the age of 20, it makes sense. Because I was only testing people that were in high school, the time break intervals that I chose were realistic and made the most sense. Similarly to Haraguchi, however, after all of her tests and her experiment were complete, she posed a series of 2 questions to each of her subjects, asking them how they felt. I combined the 2 in modern text and asked it to my subjects. In Haraguchi's experiment, she wanted to find out the correlation and change of pulse rate, relation and change of pulse rate to mental efficiency, and from what she knew from Thorndike's experiments and working under Thorndike, she knew that the body temperature should rise, whereas the pulse should decrease. Thorndike thought feelings of fatigue were not in any definite way related to mental efficiency, so what Haraguchi wanted to do was find out the direction and amount of change of feeling of fatigue during continuous mental work. She also wanted to find out the correlation between the state of feeling and of efficiency. She wanted to see the correlation between change in feeling and change in efficiency during continuous mental work in general. And Thorndike found that efficiency of mental functions are not less after certain hours of mental work. She wanted to see the amount of fatigue caused by continuous work and the course of change in efficiency during continuous work. Thorndike believed that effective mental work is very largely restricted to the special function exercised. Influence of such mental work for a school student upon the special mental functions, such as adding or memorizing, is what Haraguchi focused on. As shown prior in the setup, she did a adding influence of special mental functions on other functions. For example, adding to, say, memorization. Amount, rate, and change of the special mental function exercised. And amount of fatigue transferred in other functions. Here are videos of 2 of my subjects who have given me consent to use them within this documentary. They represent just a small population of the experiment. As you see these, you will see them go through mental fatigue throughout the experiment.
Niz ver jam paf biv cat dot muz yob mav. Okay. I sound like a sim. Niz ver jam paf biv cat dot muz yob mav. Niz ver, damn it. Niz ver jam paf biv cat dot muz yob mav. Niz ver jam ver almost very paf. No. Jom paf. Niz ver jom paf biz cat dop muz yob nav.
Niz ver jom paf biv cat dop muz yob nav.
How much time did I get? Have I been doing this for 5 minutes only? How has it felt like I've been doing this for 20 minutes? Drive. Alright. 1, 14, 17, 16, 15. It's chive. Porta should be like port, because Italy is like a sea city. Not sea city, it's a country. There's an ocean by it. That kind of sounds like the French word for sink, so I'm just going to put that down. I got 1 word left.
This is just one example of a symptom within subjects. ahead.
My levels. I've got that same mood that I do at the end of a French test, where it's just like, I never want to look at this again.
My Spanish is not helping me.
These two subjects just show that almost all of the subjects believed that knowing a language could help them translate the Italian, even if they did not know Italian. In Haraguchi's experiment, results showed that 0.22 is bound to exist between rising temperature and decreased inability to memorize nonsense syllables. Haraguchi also found that, similarly, the decrease in pulse would have the same effect. She found that nature of feeling of fatigue is very similar to Thorndike, and there was a test relation of mental fatigue to physiological processes. She also found that all of her hypotheses were in fact correct, just as Thorndike had found prior to her. Following this, you will find all of Haraguchi's results and what she had found for each of her subjects and overall. You will also find my results and what I found, as well as a few quotes that both her subjects, Haraguchi herself, and my subjects all said during and after the experiment, which correlated to mental fatigue and all of her hypotheses. This graph shows the times and the dates as well as the subjects for the mental multiplication. This graph for mental multiplication shows that there was a change in feeling, which shows a correlation with mental fatigue. This graph shows that same change in feeling from the graph prior, but for the memorization of nonsense syllables. These two graphs show the change in both temperature and pulse rate for mental multiplication and for the translation of German words. This graph shows the change in pulse rate per subject just for mental multiplication. Here are some actual quotes from her subjects. Subject CDT seems to always have a slight pain across his eyebrows. Subject MS says, and I quote after trial 1, I feel well in general, but have pain in my eyes which I never had in reading and studying. After trial 3, he says the sums of 9s and 8s confused me. I felt so discouraged that I felt most of my answers were merely guesses at these points. Here are some of my own results from some of my subjects that gave me consent to show these. It was seen throughout all my subjects that pulse did in fact decrease, and for the mental multiplication, it took longer towards the end of the test as the subjects started to get more mentally fatigued. Nearly all of my subjects got the memorization part completely correct, memorizing all 10 of the nonsense syllables and in order. Almost all of them also used all 15 of their minutes. It is important to note that the break amount that each subject got determines how well rested the subjects were and how well they could reason out the translations of the Italian words. During the experiments, Haraguchi did use herself as a subject. Here are some quotes during her time as a subject.
where it's like, you don't have anything down, and you do not know the answer, and you will not know the answer, so just put something down so it looks like you tried. But I don't, like, just something random down. And I don't want to do that. At the same time, I want to just fucking put something down.
Haraguchi and I did very similar experiments, and I did that on purpose. I wanted to find out if she was right, and if her work supported by Thorndike was actually correct. What I have come to find is that yes, her hypotheses are correct. Every single one of them have been proven by me. The bias that all those male psychologists had really had no fundamental fact to them. And when doing research, all of the male psychologists that were biased against her from the very start, because of her gender, weren't even really psychologists to start out. Some of them were just small doctors, not even psychologists that worked with the human mind. And others weren't even in the psychological profession. The very few handful that were actually psychologists in China that her theories were wrong did not even work with mental fatigue at all, nor did they work in her field of psychology. They did not work with mental fatigue. This was probably why they did not have fundamental proof to disprove her theories. So through my experimentation, I have proven for once and for all that the gender bias that was unconscious through her career as the first female psychologist that she powered through was just that, a bias. Haraguchi, the lost woman of psychology, was always right. And she did the right thing by powering through it, no matter what people told her. Because without her, we wouldn't realize that our brains can only take so much, and the work that we do does determine how tired we get.